development on that story soon, but first, there's strong reason to believe that the UK and the US are potentially going to be in violation of international law, and that Ecuador has violated international law in their pursuit of Julian Assange. Now, back in July of this year, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights ruled that Ecuador must protect Assange from US extradition. And this was after Ecuadorian President Lenin Moreno met with the US Vice President Mike Pence, and they supposedly discussed handing Assange over to America. Now, in the advisory opinion requested by Ecuador from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, when they talk about the institution of asylum and its recognition as a human right in the Inter-American system of protection, they say, the court considers that the protecting state must therefore take all necessary steps to protect the person in the event of a real risk to life, integrity, liberty, or security if he or she is surrendered or removed to the territorial state, or if there is a risk that the person may subsequently be expelled, returned, or extradited by that state to another state where such a real risk exists. And then number 198 talks about how the legal situation can't be left in limbo, and I didn't know limbo was a legal term, or prolonged indefinitely, as it's seen as excessive penalty. Ecuador also has an obligation to assure Assange isn't sent to a foreign nation to undergo any of the violations discussed here, and while Ecuador doesn't have to house Assange in their diplomatic mission, they're required to take diplomatic measures under their authority and within the bounds of international law to guarantee Assange's convention rights are guaranteed. Another thing to note is that in an interview that Joe Emersberger had with an Ecuadorian legal scholar who teaches human rights and constitutional law in Hungary, they were discussing Lenin Moreno's assault on human rights and judicial independence when Julian Assange came up in the discussion. They talk about the transitory CPCCS, which is a Moreno-appointed unelected body given the authority to fire all the members of the Ecuadorian Constitutional Court, which they did. And in general, they're allowed to just make sweeping changes to the judicial system as well as other areas of the government. And when talking about Assange, Joe asks the Ecuadorian legal scholar if Moreno's government has even attempted to give a legal justification for cutting off his access to the internet, phone calls, and even most visitors with the exception of his lawyers. Assange is an Ecuadorian citizen currently, although that doesn't really matter because he's under Ecuadorian jurisdiction, which means he's protected under the Ecuadorian Constitution, citizen or not. The legal scholar said he doesn't know what legal basis they're using for their treatment of Assange, and he believes they have no real reason, or that, at the very least, there's no publicly known reason. Moreno has also said that the only right he cares about is Assange's right to life, meaning that he could be released to UK authorities or even extradited to the US. Moreno doesn't care about humane treatment or due process. And now we see where this becomes important, because this is the equivalent of having a legal case prolonged indefinitely. And if the US or the UK takes advantage of Moreno's lack of care for Assange's rights, they'll now be participants in this crime. Ecuador also has to protect Assange from extradition to another state. Now, to follow up with the story from the last video on Assange regarding him suing Ecuador, that case was thrown out on Monday, or yesterday, considering the time that I'm recording this. It was ruled that the case couldn't move forward because Assange broke a written commitment not to interfere in Ecuador's foreign policies. Regardless, the claim is that he's being held in inhumane conditions, and he still has certain rights regardless of the agreement set up between Assange and the Ecuadorian government. And it's also worth noting quickly that Moreno wasn't the president when Assange began his asylum stay. It started back in 2012 under President Correa. And not interfering in Ecuador's foreign policies seems to be a very vague statement. I mean, this written agreement was signed at the end of 2017, and it stated that Assange vowed to not send messages interfering in the affairs of other sovereign states. And then he had his internet revoked after speaking out during the Catalan referendum and after he offered advice to campaigners on how to avoid surveillance. Now, there's also a protocol governing Assange's stay at the embassy that warns if he continues to breach the written commitment, they could have his asylum revoked. Now, following the Catalan referendum incident with Assange, that wasn't the first time that he's had his internet revoked. It was also temporarily revoked back in October 2016 after WikiLeaks published all of the damaging documents against Hillary Clinton, Huma Abedin, John Podesta, the Hillary Victory Fund, and several others. But that internet revocation was temporary, and at the start of it, it was known that it would only be temporary. That was under Correa. Moreno sees Assange as a problem that he inherited, and he'll certainly have no problem violating his human rights. I mean, that much is clear. Assange is in the hands of the state, and if there's one thing that's detrimental to human individuality, freedom, transparency, justice, it's the state. So that's the update on Assange. His case against Ecuador was thrown out, and they're violating his human rights. And I don't mean healthcare and birth control, food, housing, human rights, not like that. I mean actual human rights. And no one has to give you internet. That's not a human right. But barring someone from accessing the internet when they'd otherwise have access to it is an aggression against Assange and a violation of his rights. They're going out of their way to silence him and hold him in inhumane conditions and prolong his legal situation and violate his rights under the Ecuadorian Constitution and his rights under the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, which, for the record, isn't as volatile and cancerous as the UN Human Rights Council. So that's all for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. If you'd like to support my work, Patreon and other donation links are in the description. So be